Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Rest stops are supposed to offer safety, a place to stretch, refuel, and breathe. But some travelers never make it back to their cars. They disappear between bathroom stalls, vanish from security cameras, or leave behind luggage packed for a trip they never finished. And sometimes, the only thing waiting at a rest stop is something that's been waiting a long time. We had been driving for most of the day and deep into the night, determined to reach Florida without stopping at a hotel. The plan had seemed reasonable when we left that morning, fueled by coffee and optimism. But by the time we crossed into South Carolina, sometime after 2 a.m, that energy had long since faded. The highway felt endless, and the stretches between exits had grown darker and emptier with each passing hour. There were no taillights ahead of us, no headlights behind, just the occasional flicker of road signs slipping past on the shoulder. She had been sitting in the passenger seat with her hood up and her head resting against the window, barely moving except to take slow sips from a bottle of water. I had kept both hands tight on the wheel, trying to stay alert, but my eyes were beginning to blur from fatigue. When the blue sign for a rest area appeared just beyond a bend in the highway, I didn't hesitate. The ramp curved downward into a stretch of overgrown brush, the trees pressing close on either side. And for a brief moment, it felt like we had left the modern road behind entirely. The lot that opened up at the bottom of the ramp looked neglected, the pavement broken in places, with tufts of weeds clawing through the cracks. There were no other vehicles, no storefronts, no welcoming lights. The area was lit only by a pair of aging sodium lamps, their glow muted and slightly flickering. A small restroom building stood to one side, detached from the gas station canopy. And beyond that, the darkness of the woods seemed to close in completely. I parked near one of the pumps and stepped out to refuel. The equipment was still working, though it was clear from the rust and fading paint that no one had maintained it properly in years. She opened her door and told me quietly that she was going to use the restroom while I handled the gas. She didn't take her purse or her phone, only her water bottle, and she slipped the car keys into the side pocket of her sweatshirt before walking across the lot. Her footsteps made almost no sound, and the hood of her sweatshirt stayed up as she moved toward the building without looking back. The light above the restroom door buzzed softly, and I watched as she reached for the handle and went inside. I remained by the car, letting the fuel pump run while I leaned against the rear door and tried to stretch the stiffness from my legs. The lot was silent, apart from the gentle hiss of the gas line and the occasional chirp of an unseen night insect. The emptiness of the place settled in slowly, and I began to realize that something about the air around me felt unnaturally still. Not just quiet, but subdued in a way I couldn't quite explain. I looked over at the restroom building more than once, waiting to see the door swing open or her figure reappear in the soft light. 10 minutes passed, then 15. When the pump finally clicked off, I returned the nozzle to its cradle and walked toward the building, unsure whether to be concerned or simply impatient. As I approached the restroom, I noticed that the door wasn't shut. It stood slightly open, rocking gently inward and out again with each faint push of the air, as though someone had stepped through and forgotten to pull it closed. The light above it still buzzed, casting an uneven glow across the cracked concrete stoop and the surrounding sidewalk. I stepped inside and found myself in a room that felt colder than it should have been, with walls lined in faded tile and a single row of stalls, two of which stood fully open. The third stall had its door ajar, but when I pushed it carefully, it swung wide to reveal nothing inside. The sinks were stained, the mirror above them warped and darkened at the edges, and a slow drip from the far faucet echoed faintly off the walls. Her water bottle sat untouched on the edge of the counter, positioned upright as if it had been placed there deliberately. There was no sound from within the building, no trace of her footsteps, no belongings on the floor, and no indication that she had even used the facilities. It looked as though no one had been in that restroom at all. I stood still for several seconds, trying to convince myself that she had simply stepped outside again, maybe to get air or to walk off a headache. I went back out and checked around the building, calling her name more than once and scanning the surrounding lot for any sign of movement. The silence stretched on, and the stillness that had unsettled me earlier now felt deeper, more complete. I crossed the narrow patch of grass behind the building and peered into the woods, but the undergrowth was too thick to see more than a few feet in. There was no trail leading into it, no footprints in the soft dirt, no evidence that anyone had passed through. When I returned to the car, I opened the passenger door, hoping she had simply come back without my noticing. But the seat was empty, and her purse and phone still sat exactly where she had left them. I stood there staring at them for a long moment, my heart pounding in a way that made my breath feel shallow. Something was wrong in a way that didn't make sense. I reached for my own phone and called 911. The dispatcher kept her voice calm and slow as she asked the standard questions, and I answered them all as best I could, though I found myself repeating certain details over and over because I didn't know what else to say. The first sheriff's deputy arrived nearly 40 minutes later. His vehicle pulled into the lot without lights or sirens, and he approached the car cautiously before asking me to walk him through everything again. More officers followed. They brought flashlights, radios, and measured steps, sweeping the lot and the surrounding woods. They walked the perimeter of the building and searched every inch of the restroom, inside and out. No signs of a struggle were found. No blood, no broken objects. Nothing left behind but the water bottle and the faint residue of human absence. A canine team arrived shortly after dawn, and the dogs were able to trace her scent from the car to the door of the restroom. From there, it vanished completely. There was no continuation, no movement toward the trees, no indication that she had walked back out. It was as though her steps simply stopped the moment she crossed the threshold. The dogs circled the lot multiple times, growing more agitated with each pass, but they found nothing else. No tire tracks beyond our own. No signs of a second vehicle. No witnesses. The cameras that might have once existed had long since been removed, and the gas station itself had no recording equipment of any kind. One of the older officers spoke to me quietly while the others searched. He told me that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened at that rest stop. 2 other women had disappeared from that same location in the 1990s. In both cases, they had entered the restroom while traveling alone and had never been seen again. No suspects were ever identified. No remains were ever found. The cases had gone cold with little public attention. He didn't offer an explanation, only nodded grimly and walked away. The investigation continued for months, but no new leads ever surfaced. I gave my statement to every agency that called. I sat in parking lots, checked online forums, combed through missing persons databases, and drove back through that stretch of road more times than I could count. Nothing ever came of it. The rest area was eventually shut down by the state, fenced off with no explanation beyond vague references to budget issues and low usage. The building was left standing, boarded up, and overtaken slowly by weeds and creeping vines. There were no updates, no recovered items, no closure. I never returned to that exit again. I couldn't bring myself to. I have passed the mile marker countless times on long drives since, each time staring straight ahead and refusing to glance toward the trees. I never saw her again after she walked toward that building. One minute, she'd been 20 feet away from me, walking across an empty parking lot with her hood up and her water bottle in hand. And then she was gone. There was no sound, no scream, no struggle, just an empty room, a swinging door, and a silence so dense and deliberate that it felt like the air itself had swallowed her. I have spent every year since trying to understand what happened in those few minutes. But all I have are questions, and an image that never leaves me. The moment I watched her disappear into that building, and the feeling deep in my chest that something took her, and whatever it was left nothing behind. It was the summer of 2004 when I drove back from Asheville with my daughter Lily. She was 7 at the time, sitting in the passenger seat beside me as we followed the long, winding stretch of Highway 64 toward Raleigh. We had spent the weekend visiting my sister in the mountains, and I had made the decision to drive home late at night to avoid traffic and let Lily sleep through most of it. By the time we passed Siler City, it was just past midnight. We hadn't seen another car for miles, and the road felt unusually quiet. I was tired, but alert enough to keep going. Lily was awake, rubbing her eyes and sniffling. She had caught a cold over the weekend. When she asked me if we could stop so she could use the bathroom, I agreed. I didn't want to pull off onto the shoulder or into some dark gas station lot, and the next rest area was only a few miles ahead. I had used it once or twice before, years ago, and remembered it as one of those older state-run stops, basic, concrete, surrounded by trees. When we pulled in, it was darker than I expected. The parking lot was nearly empty, with 3 trucks parked along the far side. None of the drivers were visible. The building itself was lit by weak overhead bulbs, which gave off a dim, buzzing light. One of the lights above the women's restroom entrance was flickering so badly it seemed like it would go out at any moment. The entire place had the neglected feeling of a structure that had once been maintained but hadn't been properly checked in years. Everything smelled faintly of wet cement and stale air. I parked near the entrance and walked Lily up to the women's side of the building. I told her I would be just outside the door, not going anywhere. She gave me a small nod and went in alone. I stood there with my hands in my pockets, listening to the steady hum of the lights overhead and the faint hum of engines from the trucks in the distance. The trees behind the building were tall and tightly packed. They created a dark wall beyond the edge of the pavement. The air was warm, but there was something in it that made me uncomfortable, something I couldn't name at the time. About half a minute passed, maybe a little more, and then I heard Lily scream. It wasn't loud. It wasn't drawn out. It was a short, sharp sound that came from her throat like it had been forced out in a moment of panic. I didn't hesitate. I ran into the building, pushed open the restroom door with my shoulder, and entered. The inside of the restroom was empty. The stalls stood open, and no one was in sight. There was no sound at all, just the flickering of the overhead light and the faint echo of my own footsteps. I called her name and looked in every stall, even behind the doors. But there was no sign of her. That was the moment I noticed the floor. A faint trail of muddy footprints led across the tile. The prints were small and bare, not made by shoes. They stopped at a door near the back of the restroom. It was narrow and painted the same dull gray as the walls. A rusted padlock was clamped to the latch. The door led to a janitor's closet. I hit it with my fist and shouted again, but there was no response. No sound came from inside. I ran back to the car, grabbed the tire iron from the trunk, and returned as fast as I could. My hands were shaking, but I managed to get the lock broken after a few heavy swings. The metal gave with a loud snap, and the door opened inward. Inside the closet, Lily was sitting on the floor behind an old mop bucket and a stack of leaning shelves. Her wrists had been tied with some sort of stripped wire, and her mouth was covered with a long strip of duct tape. Her face was flushed, and her eyes were swollen from crying. She didn't move or speak when she saw me. She just stared at me, like she wasn't sure I was real. I pulled the tape off her mouth and began working the wire loose. Her arms shook uncontrollably, and when I lifted her into my arms, she clung to my shirt so tightly I could feel her fingernails digging into my back. The inside of that closet was damp and cold, even in the middle of summer. It smelled of bleach, mildew, and something sour that I still can't quite place. There were rags in the corners, food wrappers, and what looked like the remnants of a torn sleeping bag. Someone had been staying there. It wasn't just a place to hide. It had been used as shelter, maybe for days, maybe longer. I carried Lily out to the car and drove straight to the emergency room. I didn't look at the speedometer the entire way. I just kept glancing at her to make sure she was breathing steadily. Her head rested against the window, and her eyes stayed half shut. I could tell she wasn't asleep. She was just too far inside her fear to say anything. It wasn't until we were nearly at the hospital that she spoke. Her voice was so soft, I could barely hear her. She told me that there had been a man inside the restroom when she walked in. He had been hiding in the last stall. She said he was standing on the toilet seat with his knees tucked up, trying to stay out of sight. She hadn't noticed him at first. She heard the stall door close behind her, and when she turned around, he was already on the ground and moving toward her. He was wearing dark coveralls that looked like a janitor's uniform, but they didn't fit him. The sleeves were too long, and the legs bunched around his shoes. She said his face was partially covered by a hood, and that his hands smelled strongly of gasoline. He didn't speak much. She said he grabbed her arm and told her not to make a sound. He tied her wrists and covered her mouth with tape before dragging her toward the closet. When he heard me yelling from outside, he shoved her into the corner of the closet and slipped out through a door built into the back wall. She said the door was metal, just like the main one, but smaller and partially hidden behind a broken shelf. She heard it close just seconds before I broke in. The police arrived at the rest area later that night. They searched the building and followed the path behind it that led into the woods. The small maintenance door in the closet opened onto a narrow walkway that curved behind the restroom building and into the trees. There were no cameras. The area had no working surveillance system, and no one had seen anything. The truckers in the lot had all been asleep in their cabs or gone. The police found no tire tracks, no tools, no discarded clothing. The closet held only the sleeping bag, some food wrappers, and a few old rags. There were no fingerprints. One of the officers quietly told me that it wasn't the first time something like this had been reported along that part of the highway. A girl had gone missing at a rest area 2 counties west a few weeks earlier. Her car had been found running, her purse still in the seat, but there had been no sign of her. Another woman had reported seeing someone watching her from inside the stall doors, but when police arrived, the place had been empty. There were no names and no arrests. Just a growing sense that someone had been drifting from one rest stop to the next, moving at night, slipping between maintenance spaces and hiding where no one looked. Lily couldn't use public bathrooms for a long time after that night. At school, she would wait until a teacher could stand outside the door. At home, she insisted that the hallway light stay on whenever she went to bed. For months, she had nightmares. She would wake up in the middle of the night in a panic, shaking and confused. She never wanted to talk about what happened in detail, and I never pressed her for more. As for me, I haven't stopped at a rest area since. Even during long drives, I find gas stations, diners, anywhere with people and working lights. I can't look at those isolated highway buildings without remembering how quickly it all happened. I had been only a few steps away, right outside the door, and in less than a minute, she had been taken. If I had waited even a few more seconds, if I had glanced at my phone or gone back to the car for something, she would have vanished into those woods, and I never would have found her. That place had been quiet. Too quiet for what almost happened. A building meant to offer safety and rest had been twisted into a hiding place for someone who had no reason to be there. That man had known how to move through the spaces people don't pay attention to. He had used the architecture of isolation to his advantage. Service doors, utility closets, unlit paths behind buildings. He hadn't needed much. Just time, just opportunity, and one child walking in alone. I had been driving for most of the day, covering long stretches of highway with only sparse towns and the occasional fuel stop breaking up the landscape. My destination was Albuquerque, where I was planning to stay with my brother for a few days, but by the time I passed Salt Lake City, I knew I wasn't in any condition to finish the drive that night. My vision had started to blur around the edges, and my hands felt sluggish on the steering wheel. I could tell I was reaching that dangerous point where my body would keep going out of habit, but my focus wasn't sharp enough to react if something unexpected happened. I needed sleep. Just a few hours to recharge. I passed a couple of rest areas earlier in the night, but both of them looked too exposed. They were brightly lit, with multiple vehicles parked close together and tall metal poles casting light across the entire lot. Something about that level of visibility made me uncomfortable. I didn't want to be surrounded by people or watched by overhead cameras while I tried to sleep slumped in my seat. I kept driving, hoping I'd come across something quieter. Eventually, I saw a smaller rest stop just off the highway. It sat a little lower than the road, tucked behind a slight curve. There were no large trucks in the lot, and I only spotted one other car parked near the far exit ramp. A single light flickered weakly above the restroom building, casting uneven shadows across the cracked pavement. One of the bulbs was out entirely, leaving a wide stretch of the lot in near darkness. The place looked neglected. There were weeds growing through the asphalt, and the vending machine beside the restroom looked broken and covered in grime. but it was quiet. That was all I cared about. I parked in a corner spot, away from the other vehicle, and turned off the engine. I left the driver's side window cracked open just slightly, enough to let some of the cool night air in without letting in too much noise. I tilted my seat back, reached down to manually lock all the doors, and pulled my hoodie over my face to block out the dim light. My body relaxed quickly. I didn't think I was fully asleep right away, but at some point, the exhaustion must have taken over. I woke up abruptly, not because I was rested or because of discomfort, but because of a noise that didn't belong. It wasn't a loud sound, and it didn't repeat. It was the subtle crunch of gravel beneath someone's foot. A slow, deliberate step, taken not far from where I was parked. The kind of sound that wouldn't register in daylight, but cut straight through silence at night. I didn't hear voices or other movement, just that one clear noise followed by a long, unnatural silence. I stayed still for a few seconds, trying to let my ears adjust. The air inside the car felt different than it had earlier, heavier somehow, as though the atmosphere had thickened in my absence. I reached up and pushed my hoodie back from my eyes, then slowly sat upright. I checked the time on the dashboard. It was just after 3:30 in the morning. When I looked through the windshield, the lot appeared unchanged at first. The restroom building still stood silent in the distance, and the other car was still parked near the exit. But then I noticed something that hadn't been there before. In the space directly beside mine, no more than 6 feet away, there was now a sleeping bag lying flat on the ground. It was zipped shut and positioned carefully, not crumpled or carelessly dropped. The bag was a dark green color, almost military in appearance. The shape inside it was too well formed to be mistaken for loose clothing or gear. It had the proportions of a person curled slightly on their side, with a raised area near the top that could have been a head or shoulder. The placement of the bag felt intentional, like someone had set it there knowing it would be seen. I stared at it for a long time without moving. There was no shifting of weight from inside, no stirring or signs of breath. It was completely motionless. My first instinct was that it might be someone sleeping out in the open, possibly homeless, or maybe a hitchhiker too tired to care about comfort. But something about it felt wrong. It wasn't just the stillness. It was the way it had appeared during the night, without a sound. I hadn't heard another vehicle arrive. I hadn't heard zippers or footsteps beyond that one. I opened the car door slowly and stepped out, feeling the chill of the air hit my skin. The gravel beneath my shoes was louder than I expected as I walked around the front of my vehicle. I approached the sleeping bag cautiously, keeping my movements deliberate and quiet. I called out, not loudly but clearly, just enough to offer a greeting, something that might prompt a response if someone were really inside. But there was no reply. No sound at all came from the bag, and it didn't move even slightly. I took a few more steps forward until I was standing directly beside it. The smell reached me before I touched anything. It wasn't strong at first, but there was an unmistakable odor, something metallic and wet, tinged with rot. I had encountered the scent of dead animals before, usually roadkill on back roads in the summer. This was similar, but not quite the same. I hesitated, then nudged the side of the bag gently with the tip of my shoe. It didn't react the way I expected. The contents didn't compress like a human body would. It shifted unevenly, like it was filled with objects of varying shapes and weights. I crouched down and gripped the zipper with one hand. My fingers hovered there for a second, but I forced myself to pull it down. I only opened it halfway. Inside the bag was not a person. It was filled with raw, discolored meat. Not cuts you'd find in a butcher shop, but large, irregular chunks, some with tufts of fur still attached. There were bones in the mix, jagged and splintered, a few clearly animal, but others more ambiguous. At the bottom, resting against the fabric lining, was a heavy rock about the size of a human head. It had been partially wrapped in an oily, stained rag that looked like it had been reused many times. The stench was stronger now, no longer just faint but clinging to the back of my throat. I stood up quickly, backing away from the sleeping bag. My brain hadn't fully processed what I was seeing. I turned instinctively toward the restroom building, and that's when I saw someone move. On the far side of the structure, a figure darted out of sight behind the corner. It happened fast, just a blur of movement, but I caught enough to know it wasn't my imagination. The person was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothing, and they moved with deliberate speed. It was not the pace of someone casually walking. It was the motion of someone retreating after being seen. I didn't shout. I didn't approach. I turned immediately and returned to my car, pulled the door shut behind me, and locked it again. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The ignition caught on the second try, and the engine started with a low groan. I backed out of the space and pulled away from that lot, without glancing in the mirror. I drove for nearly 2 hours before I felt safe enough to stop. Later that morning, after the sky had started to brighten, I stopped at a gas station that was clean and busy and filled with enough people to make me feel grounded again. I made the call from the edge of the lot, explaining what I had found. The dispatcher transferred me to the sheriff's department in that region, and the man who answered sounded weary more than surprised. He told me that similar sleeping bags had been found in rest areas over the past several months, always placed in isolated spots during the early morning hours. Each one had been arranged to look like someone sleeping. Every one of them had been filled with animal remains and weighted down with heavy stones. There had been no witnesses, no footage, and no arrests. He didn't offer any theory about the purpose. He just said they were still investigating. I didn't ask for more details. I didn't want to know how many others had come close, or what might have happened if I hadn't woken up when I did. What stayed with me afterward wasn't the contents of that sleeping bag. It was the fact that someone had placed it beside my car while I slept. Close enough that I never heard them, never stirred, never knew they were there. And they hadn't left immediately after setting it down. They had stayed long enough to watch me wake up. I had been driving for hours when I finally decided to pull off the Ohio Turnpike and stop at one of the late-night rest areas tucked between exits. It was somewhere near Sandusky County, well past 1 in the morning, and the stretch of road I'd been following had grown quieter with every passing mile. By then, I had only seen a few taillights flicker in the distance, and the road ahead had vanished into an endless line of darkness, broken only by faded white reflectors. I was headed east, trying to reach a client meeting in Pennsylvania by morning. But my back was sore, my legs stiff, and my thoughts were beginning to blur into the same rhythm as the tires beneath me. The rest stop itself looked like every other highway stop I had visited during late-night drives. A long strip of cracked pavement lined with faded parking stalls, a concrete building surrounded by harsh floodlights, and a pair of vending machines glowing faintly against one wall. There were no other passenger cars in the main lot when I arrived, only a couple of freight trucks idling on the far end. The air outside was cold enough to sting, and the stillness of the place made the sound of my own footsteps seem unnaturally loud as I crossed the lot. I made my way into the restroom and washed my face in the sink. The lights inside were buzzing overhead, and the smell of industrial soap clung to the air. After lingering at the sink longer than I needed to, I stepped back out into the night. I remember the crunch of gravel beneath my shoes as I veered toward the vending machines, thinking I would grab a bottle of water before getting back on the road. That was when I heard the screaming. The sound came suddenly and without any kind of warning, rising from somewhere beyond the tree line, behind the building. It was not a muffled or distant noise. It was sharp, clear, and full of a kind of panic that stopped me in place before I had even realized what I was hearing. It was a man's voice, high, strained, and carrying the weight of raw fear. There was no question in my mind that the sound had come from a person, and that it was real. It echoed through the night air with such intensity that for a moment I couldn't move. I just stood there, clutching my keys and staring at the trees, unable to process what I was hearing. Then the scream came again. It was louder the second time, and even more desperate. There was something unfiltered in it, something that bypassed logic and went straight to the base of the spine. I remember feeling a sudden tightness in my chest, a sensation that made it difficult to breathe properly. The scream didn't trail off or fade. It stopped mid-breath, cut cleanly like a thread being snapped in the middle of a sentence. Before I could take any action, another vehicle turned into the rest area. It was an SUV, maybe dark gray or navy blue, and it came to a stop a few spaces away from mine. The driver stepped out and paused in the same way I had. He stood very still beside his vehicle, facing the same direction. And though we never exchanged a word, I could tell he had heard it too. Without needing to coordinate, we both started walking toward the wooded area behind the rest stop, crossing the lot together with nothing but our flashlights and the cold air between us. I had a small flashlight stored in my glove box, and I brought it with me as we stepped beyond the guardrail. The man had a similar one clipped to his keychain. The moment we entered the woods, the silence felt different. It wasn't the natural stillness of a sleeping forest. It felt like a silence that had been imposed, as though everything nearby had recoiled from whatever had made that sound. The ground was damp and covered in brittle leaves that snapped softly beneath our shoes. As we moved deeper into the trees, our lights revealed more than just empty undergrowth. Several boot prints had been pressed into the soft earth. They weren't old. The edges were still clean and hadn't yet filled with water or debris. There were multiple sets, some overlapping, some pointing in different directions. It wasn't just a straight path in or out. Whoever had been here had changed direction more than once. It was clear they had been moving quickly. One of the branches nearby had been broken off at shoulder height. The wood at the break was pale and freshly splintered. There were other signs too. A trail of trampled leaves and scuffed bark, a piece of a torn plastic wrapper snagged on a twig, a faint smear of dirt along the side of a tree as though someone had stumbled against it. Then we found the backpack. It had been partially covered with leaves, as if someone had dropped it while running, and either hadn't had time or hadn't cared to retrieve it. The strap was nearly torn off, the fabric muddy and damp from the ground. I crouched beside it and slowly unzipped it. Inside, I found a hoodie, bunched tightly as if it had been stuffed in hastily. The tag on it had been ripped out. There was also an empty can of some off-brand energy drink. dented along one side, and a cell phone with a shattered screen and the battery missing. There was no wallet, no ID, no scraps of paper, no names written in permanent marker or school logos stitched into the lining. Everything inside the bag seemed stripped of anything personal. It was as though someone had intentionally removed all identifying details. By the time local authorities arrived, the other man had already phoned it in. Patrol cars pulled up quietly, and officers began sweeping the area while we pointed out the boot prints, the torn foliage, and the discarded backpack. They marked everything, expanded the search perimeter, and eventually brought in dogs and thermal imaging gear. Despite all of that effort, no one was found. The search turned up nothing more than what we had already seen: tracks, disturbed branches, and a handful of belongings left behind without explanation. Over the following week, there were no missing persons reports filed in any of the nearby counties that matched what we had found. No one came forward to ask about a lost traveler or a missing friend. The phone could not be traced. Its serial number had been removed. The energy drink can was a generic brand sold in convenience stores up and down the Midwest. And the hoodie was so plain, it might as well have come from anywhere. Eventually, the case was closed quietly. The incident was never followed up with me. I was never called in for further questioning. Whatever had happened out there that night became another unsolved report, filed away in some county system. What stayed with me most wasn't the backpack or the boot prints. It was the sound itself. Those screams that came out of the darkness, sudden and full of a terror that felt entirely real. The silence that followed had been even worse, heavy and final, as if something had been removed from the world rather than simply lost in it. To this day, I don't know what we interrupted. I don't know if someone escaped or vanished or was taken. But I still think about the way the woods felt when we walked into them. Like they had already swallowed something they weren't supposed to have.